Satan asked permission before he tested Job. Did God allow Satan to enter the garden? Hope you can answer this, because Adam and Eve didn't know what sin was until Satan entered the garden.
All right, let's see it.
Well, there are people who do believe that Satan was actually stationed in the garden, and that his fall was actually at the exact same time as man.
So there are multiple problems with this line of argumentation. The first is that Satan is not in the garden anywhere in the Bible. Genesis 3 describes a serpent. That serpent is nowhere in the Bible identified with Satan, and I would argue is not identified with Satan until around the 2nd century CE. And so what we have in the garden is not anyone named Satan, but that brings up the second issue. There's no one named Satan anywhere in the Hebrew Bible at all. Satan is just a noun that means accuser, adversary, something like that in the Hebrew Bible, and it is frequently applied to humans and even to the angel of Adonai in Numbers 22. What we have in Job, and then as well as in Zechariah, is the use of Satan as a title. Ha-Satan, the Satan, is a role within the divine council, somewhat like kind of a prosecuting attorney. So this is someone who works for God in Job and in Zechariah. This is not the same idea that we find in the New Testament. Between those two sets of texts, we have the development of a figure named Satan, which is primarily the work of the Enochic and other Greco-Roman period Jewish literature that is developing this tradition of a head malevolent angel and other angels descending to earth to sire children with human women and introduce evil into society. This is how they account for the problem of evil within Greco-Roman period Judaism, and that influences the New Testament. So it's not until the New Testament that you have an individual named Satan. So Satan has absolutely nothing to do with the Garden of Eden anywhere in the Hebrew Bible, and I would argue in the New Testament. And in Job, Ha-Satan, the Satan, is an employee of God doing God's bidding, which is an entirely different role and divine profile than what we have in the New Testament. So trying to harmonize all of this is presupposing a lot of post-biblical innovations, then reading them back into the Bible, and then trying to make them all fit within a single framework, and none of that works.
In Ezekiel chapter 28, in verses 12 through 19, we see an interesting passage to the king of Tyre. Now, this passage has so many weird things in it, it cannot possibly be referring to just a human being.
So not only is it not impossible that this story is about a human, this story is about a human. That's what the majority of scholars agree on. And this story is weird in Ezekiel 28. There are a bunch of details that we do not find in the version of the story of Eden that has been preserved down to us in Genesis 2 and 3. For instance, it's called the mountain of God. There are no mountains mentioned anywhere in Genesis 2 and 3. But the details line up with understanding this is a reference to a human. The king of Tyre is referred to as an Adam, not as deity. The story of Eden is the story of the Adam, the human. And where people get confused is the reference to the cherub, which can be interpreted a variety of different ways because the Hebrew is not crystal clear. And one must choose how they're going to fiddle with it to make sense of it. And one way is to say you were a cherub. Another way is to say you had a guardian cherub. But the cherub isn't Satan. That requires a bunch of post-biblical theological innovations be retrojected back into the text in order to identify the cherub as Satan, because it requires identifying a cherub as an angel. That's post-biblical. It requires identifying Satan as a fallen angel. That is Greco-Roman period Jewish tradition, but it's extra-biblical, and it's after the composition of this text in Ezekiel. And if we just interpreted it as you had a cherub is just a guardian divine figure, and that's what's placed at the entrance to the Garden of Eden after Adam and Eve are kicked out. But we don't know exactly what the timeline was for this story that is being represented in Ezekiel 28. That is not the exact same story that we have in Genesis 2 and 3. But long story short, Satan is not in the Garden of Eden, not in Genesis 2 and 3, not in Ezekiel, not even in the book of Revelation. That is an extra-biblical and I believe a post-biblical innovation, and there's not really a good case to make that Ezekiel 28 overturns that.
What many scholars believe, including myself, is that the Holy Spirit through the writer, is looking past the king, the human king, and looking at the true king of Tyre, which would be Satan.
In other words, you're negotiating with the text so that all of your post-biblical conceptual constellations can be read back into the text to make the text say what you need it to say.
And so the condemnation that follows is specifically for him and what he's doing in Tyre. And so in verse 13 it says, "You were in Eden, the garden of God. Every precious stone was your covering." And then it lists a bunch of stones. "On the day that you were created, they were prepared." So it's saying he had all these stones when he was in the garden. He was precious in God's sight. Now, is it possible that all that's incorrect and God just allowed him to go in the garden? Sure. But I do find it a fascinating theory that sin entered the world at one time through the two beings who had everything to lose.
So what this creator is doing is trying to negotiate post-biblical theological and conceptual frameworks back into the Bible where they don't belong, and that's why things are ill-fitting and are not really working together, and you have to talk about all these, this theory and that theory, which are not supported by any data. They're only supported by the presupposition of the retrojection of these post-biblical dogmas. There's no one named Satan anywhere in the Hebrew Bible at all. The closest you get is someone carrying the title of Satan, which is a role within the divine council. This is someone who is operating under God's authority, working for God. That's not the Satan we know from the New Testament. That's not the Satan we know from Christianity. There's also no Satan at all associated with the Garden of Eden, not in Genesis 2 and 3, not in Ezekiel 28. Those, again, are post-biblical innovations. So all this is doing is saying, as long as we presuppose the retrojection of all of these post-biblical dogmas into the text, here are some of the things we can gin up to try to make it all fit together and sound harmonious. And that's just negotiating with the text and just coming up with different ways to make the negotiation sound plausible. And it's not, because that's not what was going on in the minds of the authors, the editors, or the earliest audiences, none of which knew of any entity named or even titled Satan anywhere near the Garden of Eden. And the fit for this video is hold fast, die slow.